pray. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. O heavenly King, the Comforter, the Spirit of truth, who art everywhere and fillest all things, treasury of blessings, and giver of life, come and abide in us, and cleanse us from every impurity, and save our souls, O good one. I want to start this morning. We've been off 2 weeks. We've been talking about reading the language of the temple, reading the language of iconography, understanding in worship what we're doing, why we're doing it, and what it says about how we approach the divine presence of God who is in our midst and who is with us. And we should always be learning. And I had this experience on, when was Theophany? Wednesday? Thursday. So Wednesday morning we had the Royal Hours. And Royal Hours is one of the few times, when I get to stand out here in the middle of the church and just look that way. Because normally I'm at the altar and I'm looking in from within the altar. So I'm standing out here and I'm looking, and I'm just sort of looking at the two carved cherubim there, right? You see what I'm talking about? The angelic presences next to on either side of the Last Supper. And I've seen that many, many times. I saw that when I converted to Orthodoxy through this parish 20 years ago. I've looked at those carvings for many, many years, and I think I've always thought, well, that's very beautiful. That's impressive, beautiful carving, but what does it mean? And I realize, and it's just the simplest connection. This is nothing profound here, and maybe you've already known this or always known this. Who are they? You're right, but what cherubim? They're the cherubim who guard the gateway to paradise after the fall. That's what that is. That's what that iconography is. That's why they're present. They're not there because, hey, we need some decorative, carving on the iconostasis, and this would be very good place. Let's just throw some cherubim up there. That's not how anything in the church works. Those are the cherubim who guard the entrance to paradise with the flaming sword. And that's why the royal doors, or the holy gate, looks exactly like this, both an entrance to a cave as well as an entrance into a gated city, the way that it's carved and the way that it sort of grades downwards. Really, really beautiful. But this is a little thing I just stood out here and realized for the first time. I've seen those cherubim all these years. Those are the cherubim that guard the entrance to paradise. Yes? Right. Possibly there's an intended parallelism there. Yeah, that's very possible. I can't answer definitively because I don't know. Yeah. But, that's what we're doing, is we're reading the language of the church, the language of iconography, which is not like, okay, everyone, understand this in this literal sense. It's beauty, it's art, it's icon, it's image, and it's asking us to use a different source of knowledge, a different understanding. And we began to talk about that 2 weeks ago, where we led up to the Jesus prayer. But I actually want to take a week to this day and talk about something else. And then we're going to pick up on the Jesus prayer and how the Jesus prayer opens our inner eye, our understanding, our spiritual understanding of holy things, to talk a little bit more about, well, really 2 things that I read this week. So sometimes I like to sort of set aside my agenda because something emerges in the news that I find fascinating. One of which will be the teaser. Did anyone see there was an article this week by a Catholic priest, and it was entitled, it was addressed to the Pope, like an editorial address to the Pope, "Let Catholics Pray the Way Catholics Pray." Did anyone else read that this week? Okay. this is just my news feed that comes across my phone because I always click on liturgical things. I get more liturgical things. But this actually, I think, was like in Fox, like the Fox news feed or something like that. We'll come back to that. Let Catholics pray the way Catholics pray, because it raises a number of fascinating questions. We'll get to that in a moment. What I want to talk about leading up to that is a little bit more about how worship defines us and how worship establishes our identity as human beings, establishes civilization, and establishes culture. And in order to do that, I want to acknowledge that we all have been educated in the West, and we've all been educated with what we might call an evolutionary understanding of civilization. An evolutionary understanding of civilization goes something like this. Human tribes were hunter-gatherers, right? They were primitive, they roamed, they moved, they didn't live in permanent settlements, they were small family clans, they hunted wild game, they foraged for seeds and roots and that sort of thing. And this was a time of prehistory, pre-culture, primitive, primeval existence. And it's only later when those tribes start to transition from hunter-gatherer tribes to farming tribes that we begin to see the beginnings of history and civilization. And the theory is that it's food, it's the desire to survive, it's an instinct for survival that leads to the development of technology and culture and civilization and cities. So hunter-gatherers learn how to begin to cultivate wild seeds and start to plant, and they become farmers. They also learn to domesticate wild game and suddenly end up with herds that they manage and keep all the time. And so we move from a hunter-gatherer society to an agrarian society. Only once we have an agrarian society which creates a surplus of food and therefore time and leisure do we begin to see humans cooperating to start building cities. And only when we build cities and develop more complex economies do we develop further leisure that enables the emergence of art and culture. And out of art and culture, we then get much, much later things like religion and worship. All right? This is all what I'm describing to you is the evolutionary theory of civilization. Civilization moves from primitive to sophisticated, right? Simple to complex. Hunter-gatherers, then, okay, we've managed to make food for ourselves. We're not just hunting it. Then we have a little time. Let's build a city. Then we have more time. Let's let artists do their thing. And then worship and that sort of thing comes later. And notice in that scheme that worship and liturgy and religion become very much expressive of a pre-existing culture, pre-existing cultural ideals. That's very important. That's what's going to bring us back to this article from this week by this Catholic priest, Let Catholics Pray Like Catholics. Worship and religion reflect culture and follow culture. That's the evolutionary model. There has always been evidence that that is exactly backwards. And it's evidence that's largely been ignored because when we read the ancients have their own foundation myths. And if you go to, let's say, the Roman Empire, the Romans didn't have a myth that said, oh, well, first we were these very simple people who were just slaughtering wild game and animals, and then we sort of accidentally started organizing ourselves into this city, and then we started. That is not a foundation myth. The ancient peoples understood, and I mentioned this book, The Ancient City by Fustel de Coulanges, written in 1895, something like that, a classicist who goes to all these primary texts and shows that ancient peoples understood the development of civilization completely backwards to the evolutionary model of the development of civilization. They believed that worship came first. And we have all of these texts that indicate that it's first worship that establishes cities, and then you have agrarian development, and then you have other forms of art and culture. But both the structure of the city, the government of the city, the art of the city, the culture of the city, it all follows from the worship of the founder. And just to give you an example of this, when Abraham approaches Salem and he meets Melchizedek, forgive me, have we talked about this before? Okay. And Melchizedek is this mysterious figure who emerges from Jerusalem before it was Jerusalem, right? This is before the Exodus. So Jerusalem before it's Jerusalem, this mysterious figure emerges and blesses Abraham and brings out bread and wine. And there's a couple things we know about Melchizedek. He's known as a priest and a king. His name means king, so he's the king of Salem. He's called the king of Salem. But he's also a priest. And in fact, this accords exactly with an ancient understanding of how cities actually get established. The establisher of ancient cities is not simply a bloodthirsty chieftain. It is always a priest. Always a priest. And that was true for the understanding of the establishment of the city of Rome as well. Not worshiping the God of Israel, but worshiping other gods, which we've talked a little bit about that already. But either way, it goes along this same ancient pattern that founders of cities are the heads of worship. And it is out of worship and liturgy and ritual that the rest of the city proceeds. And it is your identity is established by who you worship, how you worship, where you worship, when you worship. Worship was everything. I know we like to, those silly ancients. These were, again, this was rejected by modern scholarship as mythology, okay? Foundation mythology. But it actually accords, and we see that in someone like Melchizedek very well with our understanding of, and the ancients' understanding of the ancient world. Yeah, John? Yes. Yep. That's what we're going to talk about right now. Outstanding. There we go. What John just mentioned, and I'll read the Göbekli Tepe is a temple. So here's the story. This is a fascinating story. In 1960 or 1970, some fancy archaeologists from Harvard or Princeton were in southeast Turkey, which is ancient Mesopotamia, and they saw a hill, and they saw some sort of craggy stones, and they thought, that's just a medieval cemetery, and they ignored it. They just walked away. It wasn't until 1995 that another archaeologist went to that same spot, and he looked at the hill, and he said, wait a second. That is not a medieval cemetery. That is something else. And they began to dig. And they found what they believe to be is the oldest temple complex ever discovered on Earth. It predates Stonehenge by 6,000 years. It's 11,000 years old. 11,000 years old. And what they noticed was that this hill was higher than all the hills around it. So that's very indicative, and we talked about that earlier in our class. We talked about how paradise and an understanding of temples are always built up on a hill, right? They're always a cathedral on a hill, if you will, which is what the lead archaeologist actually calls Göbekli Tepe, is the first cathedral on a hill. It's built up on a hill, it's higher, but it's clear that the domed top looks unnatural. It doesn't look like nature constructed that. So they began to dig, and they began to discover right under the surface. In fact, it was so close to the surface that the stones had actually been chipped by plows over the centuries. Massive stone pillars that have been buried. Huge monoliths, elaborately carved. The carvings were largely of sort of evil creatures, death creatures, spiders and snakes and scorpions and wolves and anything that you associate with a danger to humanity. And they dug more, and what they found was that this was a huge complex, maybe 32 acres, absolutely enormous. The lead archaeologist estimates that they could dig for another 50 years and barely scratch the surface. And these are all built as concentric rings of pillars, kind of like Stonehenge. But again, remember, this is 6,000 years earlier than Stonehenge, okay? Concentric rings of circles that apparently were constructed and then intentionally filled in, and then another layer was constructed on top. And so that's why they feel like they can just keep going down and down and down and out and out and out, and it's bigger and bigger and bigger. And it as absolutely as John has indicated, what we're talking about, it has upended the evolutionary theory of civilization. The problem with Göbekli Tepe is that it shouldn't be possible. 11,000 years ago, there were no stone tools. They were using flint, chips to sort of do things. There was no organized society. There was no farming. This Göbekli Tepe predates the domestication of animals and farming by 1,000 years. So how could this massive temple complex, which apparently, according to the evolutionary theory of civilization, wouldn't have been possible unless you had farming and agriculture, establishing cities, establishing broad-based human cooperation to build something like that? It doesn't make sense, okay? It completely flips the script, and it goes back to the script of the ancients, what the ancients knew, and what we in the Orthodox Church have always known. It goes back to this image of Melchizedek. It's not civilization that establishes worship as a reflection of its own values. It's worship that comes first, and everything else follows. So these were, and we know from the dig, we know what the people who were building Göbekli Tepe were eating, and it was wild game. It was not domesticated animals. There's all this evidence of wild game. And we should note, nowadays, if you go to this area, it's basically desert. But back then, and especially 11,000 years ago, it would have looked like paradise. It would have been a place of great greenery, rolling hills, herds, wild herds grazing, ponds and lakes and rivers filled with geese and ducks. We know this because we have all their bones. Their bones are still there. Fruit trees growing everywhere, and we have evidence of those, the seeds from those fruit trees and everything else. This absolute paradise where these hunter-gatherer tribes gathered together and built this massive temple complex. What were they doing, and who were they worshiping? The most likely explanation of this is that this was a burial site. And remember what we talked about several weeks ago now, I guess, is that the way the ancients understood worship is that they were worshiping their ancestors. And so the establishment or the basis of private property, for instance, is land on which your ancestors is buried. You now are tied to that land. You have to stay on that land. It's yours, and you have to tend to their tomb. You have to feed the dead, and bringing food to their graves and that sort of thing all proceeds from that. So it was likely, they don't know for sure yet, but likely this was an elaborate burial site and a temple complex. Another example, though, of that helps us understand the mindset are the pyramids, right? The pyramids of Egypt. What are they doing in the pyramids of Egypt? Why were they building them? I never really understood this, by the way. You're told, oh, well, these are the tombs of the pharaohs. Well, that seems like a waste. You're building this massive thing with thousands of workers and untold wealth to build a pyramid just so that you can put a dead pharaoh in the middle of it. But that's not what they thought they were doing. They weren't just burying the pharaoh in the pyramids. They were creating a temple, and they would worship the god pharaoh at the temple. And so there would have been, in Egypt, for instance, an elaborate system of continuing to worship the pharaoh as a divine ancestor, feeding him, making sure food and water went into the inner chambers where the pharaoh now dwelt, and making sure that you appeased him so that his blessing remained upon you. All right, so this is the way ancients thought. You worship your ancestors. Here's an interesting thing, too, and this is a sidebar. The word for the soul of a departed person in the ancient world in Greek, did we talk about this? Do you know, interestingly, what it is? It's daimonion, from which we get the word demon. Yeah. And it's fascinating because if you look at varying studies of how the fathers of the Orthodox Church understand things, something like ghosts, right? In the popular mythology or popular idea, what is a ghost? A ghost is the spirit of someone who's dead in our movie culture, right? And so a ghost story is someone has come back from the dead, or someone never left, or they're haunting a space. And the fathers have always said that that ghosts don't really exist, that the spirit of the dead aren't really roaming about, that those are demons. But that's complicated by the fact that in the ancient world, that's what they called the spirits of the dead. They called them demons. They did not mean by that necessarily fallen angelic beings who joined Lucifer in his expulsion from heaven, and therefore are like Baal and Beelzebub and all these varying characters. This gets complicated, and I really offer it just as an interesting sidebar. But in the Greek, the ancient world saw the spirit of the ancestor. They called them daimonion, or demons, and they worshiped them as divine. And so that's what's happening in the pyramids. That's likely what was happening at Göbekli Tepe, is that they were worshiping their ancestors. So what's so important about this is, as we said, it upends this evolutionary theory of civilization, and it shows that what is deep in our DNA, what's deep in our hearts, is an instinct to worship. It's an instinct to worship. In fact, we can look at the fall, the first 3 chapters of Genesis, which we've already established. Paradise is not just a primitive sort of garden where you just eat. It's actually a temple complex in and of itself. Paradise is a story, and the fall from paradise is a story of moving from true worship to false worship. Either way, worship is primary. And we're going to hear that in the gospel today. And the third temptation, well, it's the gospel from yesterday, actually, but I'm going to be preaching on it in addition to the gospel today. The third temptation of Christ in the desert after his baptism, the theophany. The devil says to him, I will give you all the wealth in the world if you do what? Worship me. Yeah. And you see, that's what Adam and Eve did on the first temptation, which the first temptation for Christ was food, bread, turn the stone into bread. Adam and Eve only got to the first temptation, right? Eat this fruit. And it's the same idea. They go from worshiping the true God of the temple of paradise to worshiping the accuser, worshiping Satan. So worship is primary. And what's fascinating is to understand that it's not worship that happens after human beings have already learned how to organize themselves around other things like the building of cities. It's worship that formed the focal point of why hunter-gatherer tribes gathered and began to form cities, right? And it's out of that gathering that you then have the need to domesticate animals and to begin to farm so that you produce food for your population. And it's out of that worship that you get art and culture and all the art of the ancient world. We've always known this. It all starts from the holy, right? The human image of what is transcendent. Art is supposed to lift us up. It is not supposed to tear us down, as so much art does today. A lot of art is about exposing and degrading. But art to the ancients was an expression of what is upwards and holy and important. So it's worship that establishes everything, and everything else that comes and flows from worship. The important thing for us to know is we live in a world that operates on the opposite principle, you see. Not only did we have an evolutionary theory of civilization, we built modern civilization on that theory, right? We don't think of ourselves as a nation proceeding from the worship that defines us, do we? You know, this is the complicated thing when people say in sort of the culture wars scenario, this is supposed to be a Christian nation. What do we mean by that? Usually we all understand what we mean, that there are Christian morals and the laws of the land should be moral and we should have Christian morals. And that's true. But interestingly, from an ancient point of view, you can't have Christian morals without having Christian worship. That is true, that is right? You can't have ideas that unite you or bond you without having worship that binds you and unites you. To the ancients, it is worship that was primary, and everything else proceeded from worship. And that's why in the Orthodox Church, when we say the meaning of orthodoxy is right praise and right belief. The two are inseparable. You can't have true theology without having true worship. Worship has to come first, and that is the ancient understanding. That is what Göbekli Tepe is showing. And by the way, there are a number of other, John mentioned there are more examples than that. There are a number of examples now archaeologically of cities being found that were under the sea or are still under the Black Sea, especially in the Caucasus region, which is, again, very much connected to the cradle of civilization. Signs of civilization that absolutely should not be there. They're too early. People weren't supposed to be able to do those things. But what enabled them to do it first? What enabled them to go from this sort of idea of hunter-gatherers to civilization? It was worship. It wasn't anything else. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And what's interesting about these underwater ones is that water level rise, where's Fran? Yeah. Water level rise is really easy to see in the geological record. So it's much easier to date civilizations and cities found deep underwater off the coast of Israel, off the coast of Bulgaria and Georgia and some of these other places, and to date them very accurately. Really, really fascinating stuff. So worship defines us. Worship doesn't follow culture. Worship establishes culture. And that's why in the Orthodox Church we don't change the way that we worship. That's why we understand worship being primary in our lives. That's why we understand that right belief, you've got to have right worship. And you won't have right belief if you don't have right worship. Once you let worship go, your theology starts to disintegrate and fall apart. And that brings us back to this interesting article this week from this Roman Catholic priest. Let Roman Catholics pray as Roman Catholics pray. And he's referencing this recent controversy in the Roman Catholic world wherein both John Paul II and Benedict, the last two popes, permitted a broader use of the Latin rite in the Latin Mass, the Eucharistic Mass service of the Roman Catholics. And Francis has tightened the reins, and he started to say, no, we're not going to do that anymore. This is a very fascinating thing, and it's very paradoxical. Ever since Vatican II, Roman Catholics have modernized their worship, right? So if you've ever been to a Roman Catholic church, there are certainly elements that are similar to ours, but there's also many elements that are very, very different. They might be playing contemporary instruments in some. They might be playing a synthesizer instead of an organ, or contemporary style music and all kinds of stuff. Everything has been simplified and it's sort of there's nothing elaborate anymore. It's very simple. And the idea is that worship should follow culture. This is what I'm really getting at. Worship should follow culture. And this gets into the whole worship wars of the Protestants as well. For worship to be effective in reaching people, it's got to be relevant, they would say. So if you want young people in the church, you better put in rock music. You better get out the electric guitars and the drums. You better open it up and turn it more into a theater experience. Instead of them worshiping, you better put a stage up and have a band and entertain them. You've got to sell coffee in the narthex in the entrance, You've got to have a game room for the kids to be playing, PlayStation and Xbox and that sort of thing, so that the parents can worship. And you've got to do all these things. And the whole underlying assumption of all of that is you've got the culture of your people, and however you worship, you better reflect their culture back to them, or they will find you irrelevant. They will think of you as being out of touch. Oh, those old stodgy people doing things the way they were done 100 years ago. We need to be hip, we need to be relevant, et cetera, et cetera. What's happened in the Roman Catholic Church is that as the Latin Mass gained more acceptance over the course of the last two popes, a funny thing occurred. It was primarily young people that were interested in the Latin Mass. And even in countries like Australia, which are shockingly secular compared to our American lives, right? Just incredibly secular. It was a growth in people in their 20s who are primarily interested in the Latin Mass. And what's perplexing, and this gets to the paradox, is Pope Francis is quoted in this article as saying, in response to all these young people that want the Latin Mass meaning not just the Mass, the Vatican II Mass in Latin, but the old form of the Mass, the very traditional sacred form of the Roman Catholic Mass, yes, in Latin as well. He says about them, I just don't understand this generation. How could you like the Latin Mass? Why wouldn't you like something that reflects your culture back to you better? Why wouldn't you want something that was modern? And there's this preoccupation, especially in the Roman Catholic Church. They seem to be mostly concerned that the kinds of people interested in really traditional worship tend to use it as some kind of Pharisaical, we are holier than the modernists. We are holier than the Vatican II people. We do it the right way. And they don't, that most of the instinct that says that the Roman Catholics shouldn't worship that way comes from that mentality. I actually asked a Roman Catholic priest once, why don't you do the Gregorian Mass in English? Why would that be like, have you ever thought about doing that? He was shocked and offended at the question. Shocked and offended at the question. The Gregorian Mass, that would have been the traditional Mass. It would have looked quite a bit like the Orthodox worship, but he found the whole idea preposterous. Like, no, never. We would never do that, right? And what's weird about that is the Roman Catholics, and especially the popes in recent years, have tended to look at the Orthodox and say, they're the ones who kept the true worship. All the respect that's shown to Orthodoxy by the recent popes has been around worship, and yet they openly reject the very principles of worship, that is worship that establishes identity, worship that establishes theology, worship that establishes civilization and art and politics. It's not the other way around. Worship starts all of it. Worship is what inspires people to unify and come together as one. And all the other stuff proceeds from that fundamental reality. This is absolutely crucial for us to understand. So it's very sad. Essentially, this editorial was pleading with Francis to say, let the Latin Mass continue. This is where things are growing. This is where young people are coming. And it's ridiculous that we're being told in the Roman Catholic Church that praying in the way that people prayed not even 50 years ago they were praying this way, right, is somehow completely unacceptable in their practice. It's completely unacceptable. It's an outrage, even. It's a very, very curious thing to us as Orthodox, because how could this be any more clear that you've got to have true worship if you want to have true relevance, you know? And I think here's my theory about people, teenagers and people in their 20s who have no church background, who are looking for something and they're gravitating towards the traditional, is that we have created a culture of technology and social media and all this kind of stuff that is so superficial and so shallow and banal and so keeps people in the exterior of themselves, so keeps people in the appearance of themselves, that we have inadvertently created this enormous hunger and thirst from within them for that which is sacred, for that which is holy, for that which is ancient and real, something which will stabilize their otherwise completely unstable lives. Just look at the growth in Western societies of anxiety and depression. All of that is based on an interior instability. And they're looking and they're finding in Orthodoxy, in some cases, in other instances, traditional worship, they're finding in that something that finally says, yes, that's real. All this other stuff is fake. It's literally virtual. You're asking us to live a virtual instead of a real life. This is where real life is. This is where real life begins. This is the place from which real life flows, civilization flows. The rivers that flow out of the Garden of Paradise carry civilization with them. That's the meaning of those rivers in Genesis 1 through 3, you see. Worship establishes the world. This is the faith that has established the universe. We say that at the Synodicon on the first Sunday of Great Lent, the Sunday of Orthodoxy, right? And we're talking about not ideas, but the true veneration of icons as part of worship. It is worship that establishes the cosmos. It's worship that establishes the cosmos. We've got to embrace that because in a lot of ways, as those of us, probably most of us in this room, just a few of us are exceptions, were born into Orthodoxy, which means we've been given this great pearl of great price, and we haven't always known what it meant. How many years can I stand here and see the two cherubim right up there and think, oh, that's just very nice carvings of cherubim, and not make the connection? Wait a second, that's the doorway to paradise. That's the meaning of the doors and the curtain. Those are the cherubim guarding paradise. There's so much we don't know about our own faith. One of the things that I noticed a lot in Texas, especially, because our parish was mostly converts, is that becoming Orthodox for converts today completely changes the rest of their identity as well. Entering into true worship, and from true worship, right belief, changes their identity. So they might ask a question like, how does my becoming Orthodox change the way I understand myself as an American? It's a very interesting question, but it's very common because it does. Becoming Orthodox when you didn't know it existed, and in East Texas, they didn't know it existed. Okay. How does becoming Orthodox change your political identity? It absolutely changes your political identity. And at least, it makes you more a citizen of the globe, a citizen of the world. You begin to think, oh, wow, Georgia, the country, not the state, right? Not another part of the Confederacy, but Georgia, the country, is a place filled with the same worship that we do in East Texas. And now I feel a connection to the people of Georgia, whereas before I didn't even really know there was such a thing as a Republic of Georgia, right? And suddenly your whole horizon expands, your whole experience of what unites you with other people and other cultures. Does it matter that it's in Georgian? Does it matter that their music sounds a little different than ours? No, not at all, because it's the same worship. It's the same structure. It's the same idea. It's the same experience. How does becoming Orthodox change the way that we are American? That's what so many converts had to ask in East Texas. What's interesting about that is that in the immigrant experience, I think that the opposite question largely occurred. Now that we're Americans, how does that change the way that we are Orthodox? Think about that. It's a completely natural question, right? You move from a country where everyone was Orthodox, the whole culture was Orthodox. Now you're in America and nothing is Orthodox, right? There is nothing Orthodox about America. So but becoming American for my great-grandparents who immigrated from Slovakia, for instance, I mean, that was enormous for them. That was a change in their identity. And so then they had to think, how does that change the way that we're Orthodox? Because we don't want to look non-American. We don't want to sound non-American. We don't want funny, well, we don't have time to get into all this, but I'm really throwing this out there just as something to think about. How is that those two questions different? The convert today, how does becoming Orthodox change the way that I'm American compared to the immigrant 100 years ago? How does the fact that we're now American change the way that we're Orthodox? And how do we, as a parish that is very much an inheritor of the immigrant tradition and ethnic traditions, how do we understand the dynamic of how that impacts our mission to the fact that nowadays where the likely growth of every Orthodox parish, whether you're in the South or in the North or in the West, it's going to be completely unchurched people in their 20s and in their teens looking for something that is true and real and ancient and holy and authentic from which flows their identity. That's the task. is nothing less than a missionary task. And we have to embrace that it is worship that establishes the universe. Worship establishes civilization and cities and art and culture. Worship comes first. We've always known that. We really have a task ahead of us to embody it. Okay, we need to stop and start the hour.